Bank's primary goals are. What does the Reserve Bank actually look like? As a structure, well, it's a private entity, first of all. It's not owned by the government as such. It's actually owned by shareholders, which gets a lot of people very annoyed. And I don't know, maybe you've seen a debate about it, maybe you haven't. But basically, you can own a share in the Reserve Bank, right? And so people, there's a sort of large vocal group of people who feel like this is not right, that it should be entirely owned by government. But really what they don't understand is that the Reserve Bank as a private institution is more a symbolic thing than it is anything else. In other words, you can own a share in the Reserve Bank, and if you're and I think it always pays on a yearly basis a fixed nominal return of something like 7% or something. So if you own a share in the Reserve Bank and a share costs R1, for example, every year it pays you a dividend of like 7 cents. So it basically pays you the same as what you would, if you had a bank account, right? It's just, that's what owning a share in the Reserve Bank is. Doesn't matter how much profit the Reserve Bank makes, doesn't matter how much loss the Reserve Bank makes, you always just get the same dividend. There's no, put it this way, there's no profit motive for owning a share in the Reserve Bank, right? You're never going to make money out of owning shares in the Reserve Bank. So if you own a share in the Reserve Bank, it's more just a symbolic thing to say, oh, I have a piece of paper that says I own a share in the Reserve Bank. Yeah. I mean, I suppose you could say the share price changes, but it's like, again, it's not something that really matters, right? In other words, if you buy a share of a company on the JSE, right? That share price fluctuates in terms of what you expect to earn as a payment on that share price, right? So, in other words, if the firm's expected profits go up, you see that the share price goes up. If suddenly there's like an unexpected loss, the share price drops, right? If people start thinking the economy is going to do badly, you see the share price of all shares drop, right? The Reserve Bank always pays the same amount, no matter what, right? So like, what does the share price of the Reserve Bank do? Like, it doesn't, there's no real fluctuation, because no one cares. You're just getting a fixed amount, right? Also, it's not traded on the JSE. It's traded on the secondary market. And it's not like you get any significant profits, which is why I say it's basically the same as having a deposit in a bank account. If you want a secure return on your investment, buy a government bond. It'll give you a higher return, basically, or stick your money in a bank account. It'll give you as much of a solid return as what you would get from owning a share in the Reserve Bank. So you don't buy a share in the Reserve Bank to make money, really. You just buy it to say, oh, I own the Reserve Bank. And the reason that it's privately owned is as I say, it's primarily symbolic to say that the Reserve Bank is not, or is a separate entity to the executive, okay? In other words, the executive makes decisions on things like fiscal policy. So the executive is Zuma and the cabinet, right? President and his cabinet, that's the executive. They do not make monetary policy decisions. That's made by the Reserve Bank. And the Reserve Bank is not owned by government, right? It's privately owned. And that's a symbolic, there is a symbolism, right? Which says this is not the executive making decisions, it's a separate entity. However, the Reserve Bank is managed by the Monetary Policy Committee. And the Monetary Policy Committee is the committee that actually sets monetary policies, right? And the Monetary Policy Committee has, I think it's like is the governor and 3 deputy governors or something like that, as well as, I don't know, I think it's like another 3 officials from within the bank, 3 senior officials. So I think it's about 7 people on the committee. And the chair, the governor of the Reserve Bank is deployed or appointed, whatever you want to say, by the president. In other words, the president says who is in charge of the Monetary Policy Committee. The governor of the Reserve Bank is set by the executive. So in as much as the Reserve Bank is its own entity, it still has, political, it's not exempt from the political, whatever, machinations, right? But it is supposed to be independent in its setting of monetary policy, right? In other words, it is not meant to chase targets set by the executive. Monetary policy sets targets which are given to it by Parliament, which at this point in time is inflation targeting. That's what it needs to do. And obviously Parliament is separate too. The executive, the three primary branches of the government, you have the executive, you have Parliament, and you have the legislature. And Parliament makes laws, the legislature enacts laws, and the executive makes decisions about how things should be governed in the economy. What we've seen, of course, in the last, increasingly over the last 5 years, is that the executive controls Parliament, and Parliament and the executive have been fighting a lot of battles against the legislature, and essentially the only thing that is keeping the executive in check and prevented the executive from essentially looting the treasury has been the legislature. So we've got the Constitution and the courts have essentially prevented the executive from doing what it wants to by basically just, literally looting the treasury, just spending money in a way that is very dangerous and basically puts a lot of money into the pockets of those that are connected to the executive. So having three independent arms is very important to keep different parts in check, and we've seen that it has been, thankfully, keeping the executive in check over the last 5 years, despite continued attacks against the legislature. So we'll watch that space. 2019 is coming. We'll see what happens. Okay, anyway, so you got the Monetary Policy Committee, which which governs the Reserve Bank, basically makes the decisions which the Reserve Bank then implements. How it implements those decisions, in other words, what are the tools that it uses to enact the decisions that are made by the Monetary Policy Committee. So the Monetary Policy Committee, it's the MPC. The tools that the MPC can use there are three of them. There's the required reserve ratio, there's the repo rate, and then there's the open market operation. So those are the three tools, and they all work in very similar ways. What is the required reserve ratio? The required reserve ratio is basically a regulatory tool, and the Reserve Bank says to the commercial banks, right, any value of deposits that you have to keep a certain amount of those deposits in cash on your balance sheet at all times. You always have to have a certain amount of cash, okay? And it's a percentage of deposits. And we as the Reserve Bank tell you what that minimum percentage is, okay? Again, remember, what is the problem? If people want to convert their deposits into cash, the banking system needs to be able to pay out cash. If it's not able to pay out cash, that destabilizes the system. So one of the ways in which the Monetary Policy Committee can try and maintain stability is to say to the banks, right, there's a certain amount of cash you have to keep on your balance sheet. So that's one of the things it can do. The second is now the repo rate. What is the repo rate? I gave you that sort of description about a bank needing to borrow money from the Reserve Bank. When it borrows money from the Reserve Bank, the price of the money that it borrows, in other words, the interest rate that it pays to the Reserve Bank, is called the repo rate, right? So this is the main mechanism that the Reserve Bank uses to implement its monetary policy. It's the refinancing system, okay? So the Reserve Bank provides finance to banks to meet their reserve requirements at an interest rate called the repo rate, right? So in other words, if a bank ever needs to get cash from the Reserve Bank, needs to borrow cash from the Reserve Bank because it's got a shortfall of cash, when it does that, it pays the Reserve Bank an interest rate called the repo rate. And the Reserve Bank can change that repo rate whenever it wants to. It can make it higher, it can make it lower. And then finally it does something called open market operations. And the open market operations is essentially where the Reserve Bank goes into the bond market, in other words, enters the bond market and either purchases or sells government bonds. Okay? So in other words, there is just like you or anyone else can purchase bonds from the government, the Reserve Bank can do the same thing. It purchases bonds from the government. Once it's purchased bonds from the government, it can also go into bond markets and sell those bonds directly into the markets, or can purchase additional bonds from the markets. And that's called an open market operation. So this is the purchase or sale of treasury bills issued by government and government bonds, as well as Reserve Bank debentures by the Reserve Bank in the open market. Okay? What all three of these tools, in other words, required reserve ratio, repo rate, and open market operations, all three of them are ways in which the Reserve Bank can manipulate the interest rate. And it manipulates the interest rate by controlling, essentially what we said here, by controlling the money supply. And the reason that it wants to control the money supply is in order to control inflation. So we're going to talk when we get to the chapter on monetary policy in great deal about how the Reserve Bank does that. But essentially, these are the three tools that allow it to do it. And what an open market operation does, and we've got this basically a balance sheet example here. First of all, the Reserve Bank buys securities in the open market. What does it do if it buys securities? Well, if you can imagine, there's here a bank. We've got Nedbank. Okay, so we're looking at the balance sheet of Nedbank, and we're looking at the top here at the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank. If the Reserve Bank purchases securities in the open market, it can do so by purchasing those securities either directly from a bank like Nedbank, or by purchasing the securities from a client of Nedbank. Whether it purchases them directly from Nedbank or whether it purchases them from a client of Nedbank, the same process is happening here. Nedbanks, the value of whatever their securities will go down. So here the Reserve Bank is buying securities to the value of 100. The securities that Nedbank holds, right? Remember we said that the balance sheet of a bank can hold cash, can hold bonds. These are securities, so these would be called securities, right? Or it can have loans, so government bonds, right? So the Reserve Bank enters into the open market. It purchases bonds from Nedbank, for example. So the value of bonds that Nedbank holds goes down, right? And when the Reserve Bank purchases those bonds, what does it do? It pays with cash that it has printed. So the value of cash that Nedbank now will have on its balance sheet is higher. So reserves, in other words, cash. Okay, so we said cash. When banks hold cash, we call that reserves. The value of reserves that Nedbank has will go up. What happens to the balance sheet of the Reserve Bank? Well, its assets will go up by 100 and its liabilities go up by 100. The liabilities to the Reserve Bank are the reserves in the banking system. Any questions on this accounting activity happening here? Do you understand it? Does it make sense? Are you with me? Are you lost? So the Reserve Bank, when it buys securities, it pays with cash, right? When it pays out cash, its liabilities go up. In other words, any cash that the Reserve Bank issues is a liability to the Reserve Bank. Okay? Remember, liability is basically like a debt. It's something that you owe. Okay? When the Reserve Bank issues cash, remember I said a nice way, or to me the most intuitive way of thinking about money is as a debt instrument, right? So the Reserve Bank is issuing debt instruments. So when it issues cash, these are basically short-term loans. It has short-term loans on this side of on the liability side of its balance sheet, and it holds long-term loans on the asset side of its balance sheet. Those are the government securities. Nedbank, it will convert long-term assets into short-term assets. What does this do? This increases the amount of cash available to Nedbank, right? So in other words, if the Reserve Bank wants to increase the amount of cash available within the banking system, it can convert government bonds, which are a kind of debt, a long-term debt, into cash, which is a very short-term liquid debt, through an open market operation by buying securities, converting securities into cash. That's one of the things that the Reserve Bank can do. It's what's special about the Reserve Bank. Because it can print cash, it can convert long-term securities into short-term securities, which then changes the structure of the balance sheet of the commercial banking system. This is a cash injection. We would call this a cash injection. When the Reserve Bank buys securities, it injects cash. The amount of cash in the system goes up. Alternatively, if the Reserve Bank thinks there's too much cash in the system, it can sell securities. So if it has securities on its balance sheet, it sells securities. Securities go down. If it sells securities to the banking system, either by directly selling it to a bank or by selling it to a customer of the bank, doesn't matter whether it's the bank or a customer, the same thing happens. The amount of securities, right, held within the banking system will increase, and the cash available within the banking system will decrease. Why? Because people will buy securities with cash. You give cash over to the Reserve Bank in order to purchase a security. So cash goes down, securities goes up, which means the reserves that Nedbank holds at the Reserve Bank go down. This reduces the amount of cash available in the system. So remember what we said, what does the Reserve Bank want to do? It wants to control the money supply. How does it control the money supply? One of the ways it controls the money supply is through an open market operation. It can either inject cash into the system, or it can extract cash from the system. So when the Reserve Bank sells securities, it reduces the amount of cash available in the system. So remember, the money supply, one of the components of the money supply is cash. So here it's messing around with the amount of cash available. When it messes around with the amount of cash available, it messes around with the money supply. Why does it want to mess around with the money supply? Because by controlling the money supply, what we'll see when we talk about monetary policy, by controlling the money supply, you can control the price level. You can control inflation. So when the Reserve Bank uses open market operations, it adjusts the money supply. When the Reserve Bank either changes the required reserve ratio or changes the repo rate, what that does is it changes the amount of cash that banks have to keep on reserve, which changes the amount of loans that they can make. By changing the amount of loans they can make, it changes the amount of deposits that people can have within the banking system. Remember, deposits are the other component of money supply. Money supply is made up of cash and deposits. So either the Reserve Bank can mess around with the amount of cash directly, or by changing one of these two, the required reserves or the repo rate, it changes the amount of deposits. When it changes deposits, it's also affecting the money supply. Again, why do you want to affect the money supply? To mess around with inflation. You want inflation to go up or down. You do that by changing the money supply, which you can do either by changing deposits through required reserves or repo rate, or by changing cash directly through open market operations, which also affects deposits. How then do banks affect the money supply through deposits? So, as I say, this chapter refers to banks creating money. I don't like to refer to banks creating money. I think it's a confusing way of describing what happens, but nevertheless, what happens is the money supply is made up of deposits, and banks control deposits. Okay? They can create deposits in a sense, and in the sense that they can create deposits, they can create money. So what banks create are deposits. And they can create deposits by making loans. So again, do they make money? No, they don't really make money. What they can do is they can issue loans. And by issuing loans, that changes the value of deposits. By changing the value of deposits, you change the money supply. So in that sense, banks create money. They don't really create money, though. how do you create deposits by making a loan? That's what we're going to talk about. Okay? I want to come back to this slide after discussing this issue here and discussing this diagram here, which comes from the back of your chapter. In other words, right at the end of chapter 25 is this kind of extra mathematical business that happens. And I don't know why they took it out of the chapter. I think it's very important and it shouldn't be separate from the chapter. Anyway, let's first describe the situation and then we'll show it mathematically. We've just spoken about this open market operation. In other words, the Reserve Bank can increase the amount of cash that a bank has on reserve, okay, through an open market operation. So let's say that this is what the bank is, that the Reserve Bank, by increasing the money base, it has increased cash, okay? So this means increase cash available, right? Remember the monetary base, what I stated previously was that the monetary base is cash in reserve plus cash and notes and coins in circulation, okay? So the money base means any cash that you have in the system, okay? So if the Reserve Bank increases the amount of cash in the system through, for example, an open market operation, increases the amount of cash in the system by injecting cash onto banks' balance sheets. By increasing the amount of cash, what happens is the bank itself, the commercial bank itself, has excess reserves. In other words, it has more cash than what it needs. Remember, the required reserves are what the Reserve Bank tells the banking system it has to keep. Okay? You have to keep some cash on your balance sheet. But when the bank keeps cash on its balance sheet, it earns no interest on cash. It would rather lend that cash to someone else in the sense, in either by purchasing a government bond or by loaning the cash out. But some cash it has to keep in its balance sheet. If the Reserve Bank basically injects cash onto the bank's balance sheet, it has excess reserves. It has more cash than what it wants. What does it do with that cash? It's going to lend some of that cash out. When it lends that cash out, what happens is it's going to increase deposits. Okay, so deposits will increase. Of course, an increase in deposits means an increase in the money supply, right? So the quantity of money increases. There's an increase in money supply. Okay? So new deposits, what happens once you've got new deposits within the system, in other words, new money supply, people use those deposits to make purchases. Okay? So the new deposits are used to make payments or purchases. Okay? Any new payments that are made become new deposits, right? Those new deposits get injected back into, or get deposited back into the system as cash, okay? So in other words, any new payment comes back to the banks in the form of cash deposited. So deposits of cash, okay? So deposits increase, those deposits may get used as payments, which become deposited back in the system as cash, which means, once again, you've got excess reserves. What does the bank do with excess reserves? It lends it out. Okay? So what happens when the Reserve Bank injects cash into the banking system? You end up with more deposits. So how do banks create money? By lending money, in other words, by generating loans which create more deposits, and that increase in deposits increases money supply. So what happens if we consider this mathematically? Imagine in this example that we've got the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank increases the monetary base by 100,000 Rand. In other words, injects cash of 100,000 Rand. Okay? Injects that cash onto the bank's balance sheet by essentially buying government bonds from the bank. The bank now sits with 100,000 Rand on its balance sheet, 100,000 cash. What does it do? It lends that 100,000 cash. So it generates a loan of 100,000 Rand. Okay? Of that loan of 100,000 Rand, we're going to split this. First of all, we're going to talk about it in a relatively complicated way by describing this currency split, and then later we'll talk about sort of making it less complicated by not worrying about this currency split. But anyway, it makes a loan to people. What happens with that loan? Some of that loan gets held as cash in people's wallets. Okay, so in other words, when the bank lends that money out to people, some of that gets held as currency, cash in people's wallets. Some of it gets deposited back into the banking system. When it gets deposited back into the banking system, some of that deposit must be held by the bank as a reserve, but the rest of it, it can lend out once again. So of that deposit, it lends out some more. Of that loan, we now repeat the process. Some of it gets held as currency in wallets, some of it gets deposited. Of that gets deposited, some of it gets held as reserves, some of it gets loaned out once again. And the process continues, right? Each time, however, if we follow this process, you can see that each time the amount that the bank is lending out is smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay? Initially, 100,000 Rand increase in cash gets injected into the asset side of the bank's balance sheet. 100,000 Rand cash. The bank lends that entire 100,000 Rand. Some of that becomes currency, which stays circulating outside of the banking system. Some of it, and here we've got 66% of it, gets redeposited. Of that increase in deposits, there is a required reserve ratio of 10% in this example. So the bank has to keep 10% of any deposits in cash. So there's new deposits of 66,000. The bank must keep 6,000 of that in reserve, but it can lend out the remaining 60,000. So it lends out another 60,000. So whereas initially 100,000 in cash was deposited, it led to loans of 100,000. Those loans of 100,000 generated new loans of 60,000. Those new loans of 60,000 will generate new loans of a lower amount than 60,000. And then those new loans will generate new loans and new loans and new loans, every time getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Until eventually no new loans can be issued. You with me? So then the question is, well, how much can then be generated? How many new loans will eventually be generated? What would the value of all those loans be if we added them up? And the way we can calculate the value of all those new loans is essentially by using geometric sequence, sum of a geometric sequence, right? The mathematical note goes through the details of how we essentially get to this equation here. If we take the amount A being 100,000, and then of A, 100,000, 60% of A gets loaned out, and then 60% of that 60,000 gets loaned out, and then 60% of that 60% gets loaned out, and then 60% and 60 and 60 and 60. What we're doing is you can add it up as this is A is 100,000 plus 0.6 times A, right? So that's 100. That's 0.6 times 100. Then this would be 0.6 times 0.6 times 100, and so on. The sum of this sequence to infinity, right, just continuously getting smaller and smaller, is given by this really nice simple equation, A divided by 1 minus L. Okay? In other words, the total value of all these things added together will be equal to A divided by 1 minus L. In other words, it will be 100 over 1 minus 0.6. So 100 divided by 0.4. that will be the total value of all those things added up. Okay? Now, 1 minus 0.6 is 0.4, right? And divided by 0.4 is the same as divided by 4 over 10, which is the same as times 10 over 4, which is the same as times 2.5, right? So what would the total value of all these things be? 100 divided by 0.4 is the same as 100 times 2.5, it's 250. Okay? So that initial increase in money of 100,000 leads to a total increase in the money supply of 250,000, right? 100 times by, let's do it by 100 divided by 0.4, which is the same as 100 times 2.5. Okay? So an increase in the monetary base, in other words, an increase, this was cash, increased by 100, cash increase, led to total money increase of 250. That 250 is obviously cash plus deposits. So it's going to be equal to 100 in cash plus 250 in deposits. I mean, not 250, sorry. 150 in deposits.
So the bank made 150.
Yeah, so the increase in deposits will be 150. The increase in
Not necessarily the bank's profit.
profit, no, it's got nothing to do with profit. What we're talking about here is money supply. Okay, so the money supply is now 250. Okay, it increased by 100 and it's become 250. Okay. Yeah, everyone happy with that?
Would they ask us a question in the test to work out if they say the increase in money, the monetary base would be,
Yeah.
good positive?
Absolutely. Obviously, and sorry, this cash as well, given our particular example here, some of this cash will be held as reserves, some of this would be held as basically currency in circulation, right? This 100 here. Some of it would be reserves, some of it would be currency in circulation, that 100,000. And then the deposits would be 150. In fact, we can work out, given that reserves need to be 10% of deposits, the reserves would probably be 15. And then currency held would be the remainder, what's that, 85. Oops. So 15 and 85. Cool. So that is how the banking system, in a sense, creates money. Okay, that's what the chapter means, or that's what people mean when they say banks create money. That's the description of this process. So you've seen mathematically how this works. You get 100,000 plus 60,000 plus 33,000 plus etc., etc. Each one of these are the loans. So this was loan number 1, so let's call this one L1. Then you had loans here, L2, that's L2. Then you had the next one, you'd have had L3 down here, L3, etc., etc. This number here, this 2.5, in other words, 1 divided by 1 minus 0.6, this is the money multiplier. Okay, MM. Money multiplier. So it says any increase in the money base multiplied by the multiplier, multiplied by the money multiplier will give you the increase in money supply. So 100,000 Rand increase in money base times money multiplier of 2.5 gives you money supply of 250,000. How do we calculate the money multiplier? Money multiplier again. So change in money supply, M, money supply, over money base equals money multiplier. It's exactly what I've just described. In other words, we can rewrite this equation slightly differently, just rearrange it, say money base times money multiplier equals money supply, right? Got it? And obviously, as a linear equation, right, we can arrange this in any way we want to, but we can also write this as, I've already written money base times money multiply equals money supply. So therefore, what happens if I change money base? In other words, change in MS over change in MB equals money multiply, right? So if I take the derivative of this equation, it tells me if I change the money base by 100, by how much will my money supply change? Well, my money multiplier is 2.5, so therefore the change in money supply must be 250. 250 change in money supply divided by 100 change in money base equals money multiplier 2.5. Okay, so there's nothing fancy about the money multiplier. There's nothing complicated about it. It's basically just a linear relationship. So you can think about it in any mathematic, with using any mathematical tools that you have at your disposal for understanding a linear equation will help you understand what money multiplier is. So then they give you this kind of really complicated looking progression of equations, but it's quite simple. If we're saying that money, M, money supply, is made up of deposits plus currency, and the money base is made up of reserves plus currency, okay? So I've called here cash. Let's just call this cash, not C. So C here is not the same as what I'm referring to here, C. So here I just called cash. The cash would be reserves plus currency, right? So reserves plus currency, I'm referring to that as cash, money base. So C here is cash, right? Cash. Which is slightly different to the way they're using C here. Here they're using C as currency. Okay? So deposits plus currency, and they're saying that money base is reserves plus currency. Okay? Then if we want to calculate the money multiply, M divided by MB, in other words, money supply divided by money base, then it would be obviously deposits plus currency divided by reserves plus currency, in which case we can write our money multiplier. If we divide each one of these terms by deposits, we end up with money multiplier equals 1 deposits plus C over D, in other words, the ratio of currency to deposits, divided by ratio of reserves to deposits plus currency to deposits, which looks really complicated and really is unnecessarily complicated. But what makes this whole thing much easier is if we assume that the currency drain ratio is 0. In other words, no one ever holds cash. Okay? No one ever holds money in their wallet. Everyone just holds money as deposits. So if we just assume instead, let me do this in a different color. Hang on. Okay, let's just assume that currency is 0. Money supply is just held as deposits. Okay, there's no currency drain. So we're not worried about this, we're not worried about this. Okay, then we've got that M, money supply over money base, is D over R. Okay, or D over R, okay? Which, if you look at this equation here, is the same thing. In other words, 1 plus, this would be 0, plus 0. 1 over R over D. 1 over R over D is the same as D over R, right? In other words, this equation here is 1 over R over D, which is the same as D over R. So the money multiplier is just simply deposits over reserves if we don't have any currency. In other words, if we assume that currency, so we're assuming that currency equals 0, so there's no currency drain. then the money multiplier is just simply deposits divided by reserves, right? Okay? In other words, 2.5, your money multiplier, is going to be equal to deposits 250 over reserves 100, because everything's going to be held as reserves. So we increased money base by 100, which is all held as reserves. 250 divided by 100, 2.5. Okay? So if we assume that the currency drain ratio, in other words, people don't hold currency at all, currency drain ratio is 0, then our money multiplier is simply deposits divided by reserves. It's the ratio of deposits to reserves. Okay? If then you know that reserves are some percentage of deposits, you can calculate the money multiplier, right? In other words, I can write this as the money multiplier as some percentage reserves to times deposits, right? 2.5. If I'm holding reserves and I've got deposits of 250, what is my ratio here of reserves to deposits? My reserves are 100 over 250, right? What is that as a ratio? I'm not sure. No, is it 0.4? Is that right? Anyone got a calculator? Don't worry, I've got a calculator. Yeah, 0.4, there you go, okay. In other words, what we've seen here, 1 minus 0.6, okay, 0.6 was the amount that went to loans. The amount that doesn't go to loans is 0.4. Doesn't look very good, but so let's do it like this. 1 minus 0.6 is 0.4. Okay? 0.4, if we're assuming that nothing goes to currency, must therefore be your required reserves. Everything's going into reserves. So if 0.4, right, is reserves, okay, then 1 divided by your required reserves is equal to your money multiplier, right? 0.4. The inverse of 0.4 is 2.5. 1 divided by the required reserves is your money multiplier. If you have a currency drain ratio, then this doesn't look quite like this. Yes?
In our course, is our currency drain ratio always 0?
You will probably always see currency being 0, yeah. I haven't confirmed that, but I don't. Did you do any where you had like a currency drain ratio before? No, so probably not. I will double check that. Okay, so here's an example. Let's do it. And then we will finish on the examples. Get out a piece of paper and a pen. Do it on the paper. Do not do it in your head. Everyone ready? Suppose you've got this balance sheet of the banking system. You are told that the balance sheet of the banking system has reserves of 72, securities, which is bonds and stuff, of 48, and loans of 100, while the deposits are 220. Okay? And you're told that the reserve ratio that usually means required reserve ratio. Okay? So that's required reserve ratio is 20%. Okay? No, sorry, I read that wrong. My bad. So the reserve ratio is 20%. What that means is the actual reserve ratio, sorry. So they're saying that this is the actual reserve ratio is 20%. Now the reserve ratio, we've got required reserves and you can also have desired reserves. Required reserves are the reserves that the banking system, the central bank, tells you have to keep. Okay? Desired reserves is any additional amount of reserves that the banking system wants to keep just for prudence. In other words, it wants to keep extra cash. It doesn't have to, but it wants to because it's not comfortable keeping only the required reserve ratio. So if your actual reserves are 20%, then there's the required reserves of some amount and the desired reserves of some amount. Is that right? No, actually, no. I've read it wrong once again, but that's fine. My discussion, what I've just spoken about, is nevertheless true. So it's telling you the reserve ratio is required. Great. Okay. So the reserve ratio here is required. Okay, but these reserves here have required reserves plus desired reserves. In other words, there's some amount of reserves that, you know what, I'm even confusing myself now. So you have, of your actual reserves, you have required reserves, you can have desired reserves, and you can have excess reserves, okay? Excess reserves means any reserves more than what you are either required to hold or what you desire to hold. So in other words, the sum of these two would be required and desired is some amount, then anything more than that sum would be what you would call excess reserves, okay? Usually when we do this, we just don't worry about desired reserves, we just assume those are zero, okay? So let's call those zero. So the reserve ratio is 20%. We're saying that's the actual required reserve ratio. The reserves that the banking system holds here, therefore, are the required reserves plus some excess reserves. Okay. The first part of the question, the value of excess reserves is what then? Okay. So if the reserve ratio, and as I say, normally when it says the reserve ratio, it's just the required reserve ratio. Okay, required reserve ratio. If the required reserve ratio is 20%, what is the value of reserves that need to be kept? Sorry, what is the value of deposits that need to be kept as reserves? You can calculate that. If required reserves are 20% and the value of deposits is 220, what is the actual required reserves that the banking system needs to hold as reserve? Got it? You shouldn't really need a calculator, but if you do, that's fine. 20% of 220, what is it? 44. Okay, so the required reserves are 44. What do they actually hold in reserve? 72. So what then is the excess reserves? Sorry? Excess reserves? 28. Okay? So your required reserves are 44, excess reserves are 28. You happy with that? Is the color okay? Okay. I'll change it back to pink just now. So the value of excess reserves is 28. If those excess reserves were loaned out, the total value of additional loans would be, well, if the required reserve ratio is 20%, what's the money multiplier? What's the money multiplier if the required reserve ratio is 20%? 5. If the reserve ratio is 20%, the money multiplier is 1 over required reserves, which is 1 over 0.2, which is the same as 10 over 2, which is 5. Okay, so if the money multiplier is 5 and you've got excess reserves of 28, so you're going to loan out 28 billion. If these excess reserves were loaned out, okay, how much money would be created, right? So when we get some amount to loan out. We started with a loaning out amount of 100,000. How much does it generate? 100,000 times the money multiplier gives you how much money can be created, right? You with me? So we're going to loan out 28. How much can be created from 28? 28 times 5 gives you 140. What is the money multiplier? 5. Any questions? Okay. So tomorrow we're going to do this question. We're going to start tomorrow with this question. So this afternoon, go back, read over those notes. Familiarize yourself with the money multiplier, with this equation process, right? Make sure you're familiar with this, then you can do question 18 without a problem tomorrow when we start, okay?